I'm an art collecting researcher from the Czech Republic. In last decade, as you already told, pursuing primarily the post-Second World War situation in Central Europe. Yet today, my paper strives to be more methodological, sociological, and ask a bit more general question. But I hope I could at least a bit follow up the social strata discussion developed here during the first 2 days. So on the basis of data and knowledge that we have already on individual collectors, of course, in individual cases, more or less complex or fragmentary, I now endeavored to analyze for myself more on the social structure of the bearers of these phenomenon. I started to collect and analyze data on the Bohemian interwar collectors, but what significantly helped me to grasp the topic, those were the tools, terminology, and findings of modern sociology. Well, according to what we know so far, art collecting phenomenon appears to be essential part of modernist behavioral patterns, at least for the traditional Euro-Atlantic society, and one of the most significant and complex attributes of social elite's lifestyle. Thanks to the intense international research, we could quote an amount of case studies on the individual collectors, all of them within the limits of social, economic, historical coordinates given. But is there a way to systemize these findings to make them a bit more comparable with each other? My paper endeavors to examine the potential of recent concepts of two parallel middle classes of Peter Berger, sociologist, the traditional old middle class and the new middle class, so-called knowledge class, applied on the field of modernist art collecting studies. Discussing the specific phenomenon of dozens of art collections of businessmen, bankers, lawyers, attorneys, doctors, as well as publishers, architects, or artists, representatives of quickly developing old and new middle class, I am in search of structural categorization that would enable us to link certain behavioral collecting attitudes and preferences to individual social subsegment more clearly. But I believe that just this kind of structural systematization, taken into account this Berger's dichotomy or even a conflict between old and new middle class, could enhance our understanding of modernism collecting phenomenon. And as well, I noticed for these two middle classes quite differentiated references to the nobility as definitely descending but admired and still influential stratum and lifestyle indicator. Finally, I would like to point out how this way of interpretation could clarify even the post-Second World War collecting situation. Bourgeoisie, the social stratum, which adhered significantly to collecting and artistic patronage already during the 19th century, slowly, little by little, replaced the position of aristocracy in many ways. What happened only subtly for decades in the post-revolutionary 1918 period quickly gained a new dynamic. As the economic structure changed, the middle class significantly gained up in numbers and differentiated. According to what we know from classics of sociology, the class could be defined as a social group where all of its members have in common the same link to means of production, or group of individuals who have in common an equivalent position in market economy and as recipients of very similar economic rewards. Thus, the class status in modern society is given mainly by the position on labor market. Actually, the term middle class is believed to appear for the first time in England at the beginning of 19th century. Already Marx, but later on mainly Weber, operated as well with the term petit bourgeoisie, so-called small property owners in general. In addition to this, also so-called property white collars can be counted to middle class. This perception was then widely developed by the post-Second World War scholars. Between the most influential, we can find Charles Wright Mills. Obviously, his book, White Collars, American Middle Class, published in New York in 1956 and already in 1965, translated in Polish Why I mentioned this is because up to date we don't have a Czech translation on this volume. Well, additionally, with the dawn of post-industrial age, so-called new middle class enters the scene, understood as a stratum that operates with the capital in much broader context of its meaning. This is primarily with so-called human capital. The typical representative of this new middle class are people with higher education, eventually in broader context with specific knowledge. Further beyond this definition goes the most contemporary formulation by Berger. He concludes that the contemporary Western societies are even characterized by conflict between these two middle classes, the old and the new one. The first is engaged in production and distribution of material goods and services, but the second, latter, new middle class is engaged with the distribution of symbolic knowledge. Whereas in the past, there was just one horizontally stratified middle class from upper middle to lower middle within itself. Now, there are, according to Weber, two middle classes instead of one. Old middle class, this is business community, and new one, knowledge class. Thus, for the most developed Western societies, this trend, linked mainly to post-industrial age, is considered to correspond already with the interwar period. Well, how all this essential differentiation mirrors the situation in collecting community. The profession and related capital or knowledge seems to be clue variables that generated the social status of individual and opened the predispositions for the art collecting behavior. In this sense, the societal, cultural, and economic climate of 20s and 30s were fundamentally supportive in terms of quick formation and development of middle strata. Concerning of Czech lands, we can also find quite a typical number of newly emerged collections here, and as well in brand new professional types. Let me briefly mention the conditions of my survey. I considered private middle class patrons and collectors, really systemic and aware collectors actively building and expanding their sets within the period and territory. This means life collections for those this period was somehow substantial. This included about more than 5 dozens of various middle class representative, of which hardly one of 10 were female. So obviously majority were male collectors and minority were Jewish collectors. Understood like this, this survey on middle class really didn't consider aristocratic or nobility as well as official state representative collections. Well, among the professions that we without a doubt can relate to the art collecting phenomenon during these years, most often we can notice first group, those collecting middle class elites playing the substantial role already during the 19th century. So obviously the top large businessmen, but then also small, successful, ambitious entrepreneurs and businessmen, various technicians, CEO, managers, officials, but as well bankers. In the second group, on the other hand, we have those middle-class rising elites appearing as a quite newly collecting class specifically during these years, mainly various attorneys, lawyers, but as well professors, doctors of medicine, obviously often various artistic professions themselves in general, like architects, designers, publishers, writers, etc. In terms of sociology, there are groups clearly linked to the above mentioned historically differentiated categories of middle class. So from the first group, upper middle class, lower middle class, and white collars. This means in terminology of Berger, representatives of so-called old middle class dealing in their profession with material goods and services. On the contrary, the other three subsegments, this means professors, attorneys, medics, artistic professions, are those dealing with non-material symbolic knowledge, primarily so already during this period. Like this, I think we can efficiently call them the knowledge class. So in the terminology of Berger, this is our new middle class. Of course, I don't want to argue that there were no cases of collecting intellectuals like lawyers, medics, artists in previous years and decades, but the fact is that now they substantially gained in numbers, at least here. So for example, we assume that entrepreneurs running mostly technical businesses, members of old middle class with a sufficient free capital available, could have generally different prerequisites and motivations than, for example, those that are in the close contacts with the art in their professional lives, like architects, publishers, writers, designers, members of knowledge class. In any case, this is just a model with an appropriate level of abstraction, and there are representatives that fit into it perfectly, as well as those a bit problematic with the specifications or those on which we lack the detailed data that would enable us to learn more. Anyway, let's try to sketch a certain tendencies and options, preferences and decisions that could be specific or different for these subsegments. And we should search them probably in those fields in terms of general form and level of capital engaged, as we have on the one side, we have financial capital, on the other side, we have human capital, and we have as well subsegments that, let's say, these two forms of capital could be in balance. In terms of art perception, that could be mediated, but as well very, very professional in terms of models and motivations that obviously we are talking about this nobility pattern and lifestyle collecting, but is there anything on the other side? Prevailing art market strategies. We have representatives with really mainstream art auction acquisitions versus those that are searching for more individualized options. And in terms of general decisions and preferences for several subsegments, they could be, let's say, quite conventional, but they could be as well very exotic, individual, risky, or even exotic. Sorry. As a rule, the model describes the interval situation, but many tendencies were, I think, observable already in decades before, and then mainly during those decades after the Second War. And as I mentioned, there are easily readable representatives, but as well there are those hardly classifiable individuals between categories for various white collars, but as well as we talk about it, husband and wife collectors, or as well women. In fact, the most sensitive or yet to discussion part of this scheme is in the middle, where both spheres meet. Obviously, one of the essential questions for me relates to the extent the situation after the fall of Habsburg Empire in newly created Czechoslovakian state with very strong anti-German, anti-monarchical, anti-nobility focus and atmosphere influenced the structure of the collecting elites here. In other words, to what extent was the situation in other parts of Europe comparable, and what were the variations? To give one example for all, we had no colonial history. So obviously between those collectors being in love with these exotisms and orientalisms in interwar period, there are mainly art professionals or this new knowledge class inspired through the contacts with Paris scene. So, but there are no officials, managers, or as elsewhere in Western Europe. If we consider all these moments, potential scheme would possibly look like this, but it's definitely the subject to further discussion. It indicates us not only two essential counterparts that are as a rule related to appropriate preferences and decisions. There is category of entrepreneurs, often with a more or less obvious tendency to engage art promotionally somehow, as well in their professional business life, versus those category of those who deal with art in their professional lives. This dichotomy seems to be also related to general tendency heading to the more conventional and traditional market decisions and acquisition ways to more non-conventional and riskier or even exotic ones. Furthermore, focusing especially on the category of these entrepreneurs as typical old middle class representatives, we may notice even here a sudden shift in priorities, moving slowly towards less conventional set of decisions and probably as well inspirational models. This is obviously observable by the characters entering the scene during the 1930s. This means a younger generation of business collectors whose taste, I think, moved effectively towards more habitual acceptance of contemporary art manifestations. Analogically, we can deduce that significant movement in terms of powerful examples. For the top-end businessmen collectors of the early 20th century, not seldom continuing the family tradition from monarchy era onwards, the lifestyle of nobility represented really a sacred land, whereas after the Great Depression during 30s, this picture already significantly weakened, to be replaced by a universally promoted image of something like strong middle strata. In this sense, a tendency to more common acceptance of modern art gives the impression of being one of the symptomatic aspects of 30s in general. Vice versa as well, it appears that inclination to prefer more historical and more established forms of art, or to actually imitate noble pattern, is linked more often to typical old middle class collecting, and obviously notably to pre-First War generation representatives. As well, this dichotomy is corresponding in general to differentiated levels of fiscal options. Precisely this dissimilar relation to capital and figuratively also to material aspect as a whole really likely makes these two classes essentially different. We should also emphasize the differentiated behavior in terms of art market, whereas the typical old middle class collector probably tended to be primarily anonymous auction market player, participant. An instructed representative of new middle class has been more often permanently looking for more individualized acquisition options and alternatives. Just to give an example, as we expect, the significant share of ex-nobility castle furnishing placed on the interwar Czechoslovakia auction market due to legislative and economic emergency was bought, as we expect, by this traditional old middle class bourgeoisie representative. I mean the property from confiscated castles. Well, there are some indications that could be efficient for the future. It seems clear that the further analysis would be functional if applied within the characters and types that are alike, professionally, socially, as well generationally, obviously. All this ideally in wider Central European cultural and territorial context. As such, there ought to be subsegments that are obviously worth focusing on. This means namely the group of top-end bourgeois entrepreneurs, for example, high or middle class representatives, so-called captains of the industry disposing with the business activities widely exceeding the region. And similarly, as well those above mentioned, the younger business collectors entering the scene in 30s and representing the transformation of points of view. On the other hand, we definitely need to learn more about those art professionals in whose collections precious examples of European modernism met various Orientalism and exotic art manifestations, often hardly classifiable in terms of origin and quality. Yet special concern appears to be various connoisseurs, art historians, art dealers, not seldom helping with profiling those mainly old middle class collections, and then alone actively collecting. Well, to conclude, it seems that just this new knowledge class appears to be a crucial factor that expressly enters the collecting scene during the interwar period to stay here significantly as significant and influential phenomenon, at least for the rest of the 20th century. This is definitely a matter of further research, however, explicitly for the, for example, post-war 1970s and 80s collecting period behind the Iron Curtain, here in Czech lands, it seems evident that the collectors of this type disposing of symbolic knowledge, doctors, professors, artistic professions, architects, constituted the only actively operating group which became much more numerous, genuine as well as systematic, whereas in the Western world, the balance between both seems to stay significantly more in the favor of the rich old middle class representative. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcela RUSINKO, for this fascinating and very interdisciplinary presentation. I have already some questions, but I can wait with them if there is somebody wants to ask the first one. I see Milena is raising her hand. Milena, yes, please.
No, Milena.
Then me, okay. Well, like Małgorzata said, thank you very much for this contribution. I think it's so different from the rest of the presentations we have heard, and this is, thank you very much for this sociological perspective. I think it's also bringing a new light. I have a question first concerning the sources you are based on while doing your research. So how do you, yes, exactly. What are the sources? Are you basing your research on some documents from the museums or on the catalogs? What is the way of your research in this matter in order to find out the numbers, who was collecting, what was their background?
Yes, obviously. Thank you for the question. My professional history a bit explains it. While I've always been a bit between the spheres, not only on academic field, but I have worked for the long years in museum, and I have access to sources, and I've as well worked for auction market as a specialist. So I gained more from all these sources, but obviously I studied individual collectors, not only for the second part, but mainly then for the first part of the 20th century. So I really collected this data from all my colleagues that were specialized on this subject.
Mm-hmm. And one more question. This was extremely important and so clarifying thing. You noticed that there was this old middle class and this knowledge class. I noted this, that you defined the definition of this knowledge class collecting was more like open to exotism and less systematic, risky. So while old middle class was conducting more collecting, which was imitative, yes, and this somehow is corresponding with my research, where I could trace those this process, let's say, of changing of the one collection, like a family collection in case of Cronenberg or Rodwand. Maybe those were families and family collections which were maybe not to this extent changing, but you could see the change, the social change, like the father was a banker or entrepreneur, while his son was already then so to say was a member of this knowledge class. Yes, he was then studying. He was maybe a lawyer or a doctor. So this is very interesting. How this social dynamic, how you showed, was also influencing art collecting. But my question would be: is there also something like, am I right that the Bohemian art collecting was strongly influenced by German culture? And could we try also to depict something like a Middle Europe art collecting specific, or am I wrong in this?
In terms of collecting cultures, there's definitely German influence, but like we have let's say, a bit problematic, historically problematic relations with German society. So obviously, all of the intelligentsia communicated with French scene. So we have very rich contact with French scene, really very lively. So many patterns from this French society.
Okay.
I would love to ask you questions and also to add a few remarks. I suppose that the question is how far in this stratification which we propose, the belonging to the generation plays the role, because I suppose there's unbelievably important factor.
Yes.
This is the first thing. The second thing, the urbanization. The urbanization of this group, this urban group, I mean, this is very, very, very important. And this is completely different than, let's say, the aristocrats or nobility, as you name, because they were much more devoted, let's say, to the places and to the countryside. And this third moment, namely, especially when you are talking from Brno, when you have this Villa Tugendhat, so this is important, namely the Jewish members of this elite which you were talking about, this plays enormous role in this free professions, and especially in the Czech Republic, I mean in Prague and in Brno, they play enormous role. So I would say, and it would be quite interesting to discover sociologically, how many of these new collectors, if we agree to your proposal, how many of them were, let's say, what kind of background did they have? The German Jews, I mean, German-speaking Jews, this is a better word, the Czech-speaking Jews, the ethnic Czechs, the ethnic Germans. This is in the case of the Czechoslovakia, and especially of Böhmen and Moravia, unbelievably important. Slovakia is something different. So, but in this case, and you say that is the German influence. This is also fascinating, and one cannot forget, let's say, the role of Vienna, because when we are talking about German, this is something completely different in Brno than in Prague, for example. But also not only France and not only Paris, but what is typical for Czechoslovakia and which is very, very rare in other Eastern European countries, namely the very special attitude of Americans. This is also quite unique case, or quite unique attitude of the Czech Republic, or the Czechoslovakia, let's say, not the Czech Republic.
Yeah, you are completely right. You mentioned many things. You are completely right with urbanization. This played enormous role, but as well, we have many examples from Prague. We know many collectors. We have data on collectors from big cities like Prague, Brno, Ostrava, but I think we lack the data on the region. So we have just case studies from region, but you are right, on the base of what we have from region, it's different and it's much more imitative. And again, those are, for example, bankers from region that try to build collections with the regional artists. This is what you mentioned. But even if they are contemporary, they are very vernacular. Let's say these collections are very vernacular and not quite comparable with these sets from Prague, for example, communicating from German market, etc. So this is really a question of further research, and we lack the sources of many collectors, and as well we have, for example, data on collections, and we do not have the personality, don't know anything about the person. So probably you are in the similar situation, I think, with the research. But I have a feeling that you have much more researchers on this subject than we have.
And what about, let's say, the Jewish collectors? I mean, in Prague and in Brno.
Yeah, those as you said, the German-speaking Jewish collectors were really, we have examples of old middle-class representatives, as well Czech-speaking old middle-class representatives. So they are mainly in the first part of this survey. But yeah, you are right. There are examples from new middle classes, and then it's this attitude is different.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
I just would like to add that if I knew the other topics, for example, today's Nabojka excellent speech about art dealer, I would bring another topic as well.
No, we will be in touch, I promise you.
A bit more communicating with the others, so maybe next time.
No, but for example, you are talking from Brno, and this is for me unbelievably interesting place. I have to say, because let's say of architects, which were this was very modern architecture school in Brno, and in Brno you have, let's say, perfect realization of, let's say, modern contemporary architecture, similar to Bauhaus, and then they were very often Jewish students, and also, let's say, this Tugendhat Villa, what is fascinating example of especially this circle, this group of interest of the highest level in one way. So it had a kind of, how to say, it focused in a very special way the interest, and I would say this was there was not the broad elite. This was relatively small circle, but very active and very energetic, and really interested in the avant-garde art. This was no more, let's say, this contemporary model. They were really avant-garde artists, as in Dessau or in Weimar.
Yes. You are right that maybe we lack a bit the really the comparison, for example, with Poland, with Hungary, and we like these such a conferences like this because we don't have, for example, your literature here, and I think
you have Čapek.
I meant art history, art collecting studies, not literature. Sorry, but that could be the fact that what you said, that probably in comparison, these even these old middle class collectors were relatively quite more progressive, and as I mentioned, this effectively changed during in the beginning of 30s after this Great Depression, and they moved significantly towards modern art and even avant-garde.
No, I really find I'm sorry that I just try to talk about it with you, but for me, the Czechoslovakia in this period between or interwar period is a completely different case that, let's say, Poland or Hungary. This is because of this very important focus of collectors and of artists on the avant-garde art, really avant-garde art, and a very original one in a sense. So this is the thing which is not well known in the Western world, but it's also not well known in Poland, for example. One knows not enough about this very special development because Czechoslovakia was unbelievably modern country and democratic also with this modern industry. This when one sees it sociologically, this is very interesting. So sorry, that's all now.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think the legislative, quite a radical legislative reform in the beginning, after the First War, played a role. As I mentioned, this very strong anti-nobility atmosphere, anti-clerical atmosphere. I think this helped these movements that you mentioned.
Obviously.
So we could start in another part of discussion about then also politics. Yes, how politics could also influence the collecting and art scene and the development, like the more political left tendencies were probably creating a better atmosphere for some avant-garde.
Yeah, I have actually a political question as well. If there are any other questions from the audience, probably not. So I would pose my two questions, which I have. So first one was already posed by Milena. The second one, I was interested in more in the technical aspects of your project. So I would like to know how big was your sample? And how complete, and if you can estimate it, so how many collectors could you localize, and
I actually
what was your strategy?
mentioned this, and while this is really my personal survey, so it depended on what the data we have and how complex they are, because you have data on many collectors, but they are not in similar structure. So I had about 5 dozens of personalities, representatives, and various subsegments.
Okay. And my second question would be, I was wondering, like, I was also interested in this ethnic structure, but you already said that it's not that easy to define who was German, who was Jewish, who was who. But I would be interested in the problematic of the time after the Second World War and the collections of the German collectors and the Jewish collectors. So what was first of all, what was the legal status of those collections after the war, and were there any cases of restitution?
It's a very wide question. But it's my primarily research topic, so I just would like to summarize it very briefly. These legislative here and conditions were much more rigid than in Poland. So we had political processes with collectors already in 1950s and in the beginning of 60s, and large amount of artistic assets went to the museums, so they were clearly confiscated, and not everything was returned, obviously, but we had restitutions. Completely another question. We are not talking now about German property, because there were several waves. First, during the Second World War, then after the war, we had banished degrees with these anti-German, anti-nobility German legislative. So this was quite a quickly processed. During the 3 or 4 years, we confiscated all the nobility German property, and firstly moved it, transferred it to another objects, or as well auction it. These objects came to auctions. So probably a large amount of this ex-German property, it's not today in the Czech lands, while we guess there were quite a large number of these art dealers that just bought it and exported it out of Czechoslovakia. And then in the 50s and late 50s came a very strong wave those collectors that rest here, that survived these waves before, were attacked and persecuted systematically in many ways. So this was the last moment, and about in the 1960s, beginning of the 16s, we had, for example, National Gallery had maximalized the acquisitions, because large sets of confiscated modern art, old art, various antiquities, everything went to National Gallery and then to local galleries. But on the contrary to this, during the 60s and 70s, here the new collectors wave came, and this was extremely interesting, because according to conditions, there were, at the moment, there were no old middle class here. because they were persecuted. So only new middle class left. And these were the collectors that communicated with artists. They bought really in studios and so on primary market and communicated with artists and helped them in many ways. So it was very personal, liveful communication, very, I think, in terms of collecting, pure collecting period with very clear motivations and no financial aspects. So very interesting research for the research, very interesting period of normalization that ended with Velvet Revolution.
And what about the Jewish property? And what about the legal situation right now?
Most of the Jewish property ended elsewhere, United States, or were exported before the war or ended in state collections already during the obviously Second World War. And part of it, a large part of it, were restituted in 1990s.
I suppose it is in one way, of course, I don't understand that Marcela can speak in a very general frames. This is a very complicated landscape, I would say so, because they are important years between 45 till 48 before the communists came, because they were 3 years, let's say, with Banished decrets, but this was the private property. So this was in one way, everybody who was just recognized as German was sent away, let's say. This was the waivers also in Poland of the Vertriebene. And among them, there was from one side, let's say, this part of aristocracy, of the Böhmen, Czech aristocracy, which was not connected with Haha and Benish. This is the very well-known story, and they were 12 families which lost their property during the war, with Lobkowicz's family and with a lot of families, part of Kiński and Schwarzenberg. And they received these families, which were under Treuhand property during the German protectorate, they received their property back in the 46, but they lost it under communists in 48. And then they received it back, it was restituted in 1992. So this is interesting, but in the case, for example, of Nostitz, who did not belong to this family, their collection was nationalized, as is in the National Gallery in Prague. So this is not that it was imported. Then, if the question of the Jewish property is fascinating in the Czech Republic, it is not well researched, but this was different situation of the Czech-speaking Jews and German-speaking Jews, because German-speaking Jews were understood very often after 1946 as Germans. And was not restituted. That is a little bit similar situation as, let's say, the German Jews in Breslau. So the Czech Jews, the Czech-speaking Jews, received their property back. Of course, not the big industry, because this was already the nationalization. But it is very complex story. And if you see, for example, the history of the Jewish Museum in Prague, because this was collected. You probably know the story. Maybe you can say something more about it. About this Jewish museum? This is very interesting history.
You are completely right that nationality played the key role, and all the trials, all the restitutions. Really touched this question of nationality, of potential nationality. If there were any suspicion of German nationality, there was no way for returning the property. So, but in general terms, this legislative return of property, it was questioned just for the Jewish till the end of the Second World War. It was never mentioned to return the property for those German after the 1948. So they all had to go to the court and sued it for many, many decades. And just in individual cases, they were successful, but not if the owner had the German nationality during the war. Never.
This was not the German nationality. This is difficult to talk because, let's say, the German-speaking Jews, they did not have the German nationality, and in the protectorate, this was not the German nationality. This is not like that. This was not this Volksdeutsch history. This is a little bit more complicated, but of course you're right. This is not time to discuss this. This is very complicated story, but very unique for the Czech countries, because in Slovakia this is completely different. This was Slovakia, just the divided protectorate, and of course, let's say, all this Sudetenland, this very complicated landscape.
I am always. I'm very interested always for your research in the field of your. So I know that you do not call it this way. Your Sudetenland, this Breslau, is exactly topic of your book, and it's comparatively for us. It's extremely interesting, and I'm looking forward to having your book because it's essential to know the story from the other side. What was the destiny of this property? If, for example, there were some art auctions of this ex-German property, or what was the destiny of it?
But this is, in this respect, this is very interesting to discover, for example, how things from General Gouvernement, they were bought partly and sent to the Opava Museum, because this was this interaction in very, very special ways, and one has to make, let's say, the common research in one way. I suppose that we will do it, Milena. This is the role of the Polish Historic Center in Berlin.
Yes, that's why we're here. What we're here for. No, great.
Well, that's a great last sentence, I would say. We still have 8 minutes of the panel. I think the organizer, Milena, should decide what comes next.
Well, as I think there's still, even if Oksana is joining us, I think not. It's too little time to give her a possibility to deliver her paper. I think we were asking all questions, and if there are no more questions to Marcela, thank you, Marcela, once again for this very interesting paper, then I think we can slowly wrap it up.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions and for the discussion.
Thank you very much. If I could ask, could you introduce a little bit more this book, coming book?
No, this is, I just about I write about Breslau collectors, Jewish collectors. I wrote few articles. So this is very interesting book about that. I will send it to you, written by the art historian from Wrocław. She wrote about, let's say, the Jewish collectors in Breslau before the war, and of course, let's say, about partly about the story of their dispersed collections during the Nazi period. But what it could be very interesting, for example, for our common research, that partly the collections of Jews from Breslau, and especially of the Jewish community in Breslau, and the great library and collection of incunabula and very special Judaica of the Theologian Seminary in Breslau, landed at first in the how to say it in English, Reisisches Hauptamt. So by the central office of SS in Berlin, they had a few libraries and few departments where they collected among other Jewish cultural property. And after 43, it was sent to different places because of the bombardments of Berlin, and part of them they were sent to protectorate, and part of them they were sent to the Niedersilesia and Lower Silesia. And these collections were then discovered by the partly by the Red Army, partly by the Czech researchers or Czech historians or Czech officers, doesn't matter, Czech army, and partly by the Polish special teams looking for the property robbed in Warsaw during the Warsaw uprising. So the problem is that you have the Judaica and Jewish property from Breslau, partly in Prague now, partly in Moscow, partly in Warsaw, and the least in Breslau. So this would be also very interesting to also in Berlin partly. So it would be also the kind of I'm talking about, because this shows how on different subjects, I mean, of collecting and then of dispersing and looting of these collections could really be the reason for common, partly comparative, partly just joining research to discover the story of such things.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me, Nawojka, was this Magda Palica?
Yes, Magda Palica. Thank you for, of course. This was Magda Palica. This is Magda Palica. This is the name of the author.
Mm-hmm. Excellent book.
Yes.
Also.
Mm-hmm.
Magda wanted to join our conference. Unfortunately, probably she couldn't somehow, but I know that she was aware of this, that we are doing this event. So yes, this sounds like a good start for a new common project, definitely.